I've been thinking about embellishment and style. A very long time ago, about 2 years ago, I made a short film, my first one ever, and it was full of push-ins and whip pans and all this stuff, and it isn't very good. It's full of style. It was obviously, because it was a short film by a film student, in first year it was inspired by Sam Raimi, which is very embarrassing. None of it works at all. I've since pendulum swung in the opposite direction. As I shoot things, I'm very, very coverage focused. I just capture the scene. My shots are normally static. I'm not using much embellishment at all. I've only now become aware of the fact that that might be having another detrimental effect on the way that my things look. Stilted, tempoless, kind of lifeless, not coming together particularly well. And I found myself having a gut negative response to any movement in most of my shots, which cannot be good. And I'm beginning to interrogate how to use style and embellishment, especially in a world full of clickbaity social media cinematography stuff that focuses entirely on how to achieve flashy shots over traditional coverage. My takeaway generally is that I'll find my balance as I continue doing things, and pendulum swings like this are normal in the development process like this, but I would like to hear your takeaway as well. If that intro doesn't suffice, I think we can re-record it at the end of the episode as well, just letting you know.
There's an echo here somewhere that most people probably don't hear or see because it's very much echoes a lot of my own developments.
Huh.
Very often, this is where we kind of get started. Is that not sure how much of a digression this is going to be.
Go crazy. I mean, if what you're going to say is, yeah,
But do we get drawn to new food because we have been told the nutritional values, the cultural values, or do we get drawn to new food because of the way it looks, it tastes?
the latter, unless you're a nerd.
Uh-huh. So, if I make the same kind of porridge, slushy, whatever, and present it to someone, they're less likely to kind of go, whatever, than if I add some garnish to it, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of experiencing, I think what draws us as creatives is a lot of that garnish is the entry. However, no one tells us, or at least the message doesn't necessarily actually sink in that when you make it, we need to flip that process. Make the substance first, and that the garnish is the embellishment, the style is garnish. It's not the thing.
And it's definitely not something that I've experienced independently. Like, I'm 100% completely aware that most students and amateurs start off. I'm disappointed by my camera angle. Hang on. Most students and amateurs start off emulating the stylized stuff that they like to watch, or, for example, with the general trend of flashy shot construction focused tutorials and stuff on social media, emulating that kind of thing and creating kind of like substanceless regurgitation of other people's styles. That's how most people start off. I'd reckon maybe like 80% of people who started making movies first were just like, I'm going to make it look really cool and like this.
My own first little mini micro short film attempt was pretty much a blatant rip-off of Lost Highway, even down
Nice.
to using the soundtrack.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't look at that at all. I think at a certain point, that kind of style and embellishment, the decoration, the flourish, is something that happens subconsciously. It's kind of like, what is that? There's an Einstein quote on creativity. I think it goes along the lines of creativity is intelligence having fun.
Yep. If it weren't written down as an Einstein quote on Google, given that this is the image they used for it, that Facebook image, I would assume this is one of those like fake Facebook quotes where it's like, live, laugh, love, Abraham Lincoln.
This is only a theory. I haven't really seen any studies on it, and it's kind of just occurred to me in this very moment. But we spend a lot of conscious energy on developing muscle memory for doing things, right?
Yes. Sorry for adjusting my camera angle now, by the way.
Crash zooms.
Crash zooms, various other things.
Loose head reframes, non-diegetic camera movement. Sorry, what were we talking about?
You were saying things about stuff?
So we spend a lot of conscious energy on learning how to do things to develop muscle memory, right? With the idea that at a certain point, we have developed that muscle memory, so we don't have to spend as much conscious energy on it anymore, right? And I kind of believe that a lot of style and embellishment and flourishes is just the subconscious brain just kind of, yep, got this, done, no, woo, yeah, whatever.
So
adding in a little extra something just because the brain is now free or the subconscious brain is free,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
to have fun with it, right?
Yeah. I think we've spoken about style before in that it sort of happens by accident. I think you mentioned a while back that you had this during your like early stages. As I just described, just shooting stuff for the sake of shooting it would be like, oh, you have a great style. And you'd be like,
Oh
what
no,
style?
it was probably one of the most frustrating moments in my creative development. Like, what are you on
What are you
about?
talking about?
And I think also that's why so many artists are shit at talking about their own art.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. I never even considered that.
See if you can find interviews with David Lynch talking about his
I mean,
painting.
he's deliberately obtuse about it, though, isn't
I'm
he?
not sure.
I don't want to get too into it, but isn't his approach to art so incredibly subconscious that even he has no real idea what he's doing?
And that's what I mean.
Oh, okay, yeah. David Lynch was an interesting example.
That's the clearest one where we just do.
True, true. He just does. He really does. He sits in a room and he goes transcendental meditating for a little bit, and he comes out with a bunch of images. He doesn't know why they're there, but he uses them anyway. Everyone should do that.
A lot of that happens when I think it is. Today's a bit of stream of consciousness, I think, because I'm not like kind of going like a different extrapolation off on a different tangent. I think it's a little bit like the best ideas come in the shower.
Yeah.
You know, like when we stop consciously thinking about something, I'm a great believer in getting out of my creative brain's way. Feed it, i.e., research, find references, have nuggets of ideas, but then step away. Don't crowd your creative subconscious, for lack of a better word. I think if we're too consciously trying to push creation in certain directions, then yeah, you're kind of not letting that whole subconscious. I guess it's kind of like if you think of the brain in computer terms, it's like having a dedicated creative processing unit.
The CPU.
That's just doing things on its own, and it's better left alone to a certain extent.
If I were to grab what you're saying and kind of turn it back into what we're focusing on,
Good luck.
don't get in your own way trying to add embellishments for this kind of thing. Say you're shooting something and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder how I can add embellishments to this. You're kind of self-sabotaging because if you just do it, if you just figure out how you're going to shoot it, that's your creative brain being left to do what it wants to do instead of getting in its way and adding things. Or is there more to it?
I think that is one element. I think there are times and place for pure stylization. In some ways, I suspect that with current short form media, you could probably make a career out of that if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But it would be like a kind of snack style of career rather than a full 7-course sit-down dinner career, if we're going to go back to the cooking analogy.
Yeah, that's fine.
I definitely think there is business, there is career in like the snack business, obviously. But if that isn't your goal,
Then don't do it.
I think that not necessarily.
Ooh, I shouldn't finish your sentences.
As storytellers, we actually need the style and embellishment. Otherwise, it becomes just information. You know, the fact that we're actually chopping up time and reassembling it.
But then the style and embellishment sounds like the important stuff mostly comes by incidentally. Maybe it doesn't. This might be getting too broad. I'm sure everyone works in completely different ways, but
Let me put it this way. Could we tell Shakespeare's stories without the Shakespeare's verbiage?
no. I mean, yes, but
Yes, we can.
we can, but not to the same effect.
We can recount, we can tell the plot, the structure of the story, right? But some of the appeal is lost without the language. In terms of actual storytelling, that's embellishment, right? Like, who are the characters? What do they want? What are the conflicts? What are the setbacks? Do they get what they want? That's the meat and potatoes, right? And fairy tales, there's a certain expectation of language. Does it necessarily have to be once upon a time? But if we take that sentence out of a fairy tale, it kind of loses something, right? But theoretically, that is an embellishment, isn't it?
Yeah.
For actual stories, if you want to tell a story, you get right in the mood and the mode, and inspiration strikes you at the part. Do you not embellish that in some sort of way in your own performance, rather than just telling a friend, today this happened?
Yeah, that's true. Even telling an anecdote comes with a bit of embellishment. I love an anecdote. I really do. I love anecdotes. What can I say? They're my favorite thing to do.
But can you see at a certain point, certain elements of style and embellishment becomes a performative part of telling a story, no matter the medium.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just becomes a list of events.
I think this is where we get a bit more philosophical, and I'll try not to go too far because I do have more things to talk about. But potentially, this has something to do with the fact that human beings, who are sentient creatures capable of, if not inherently inclined towards abstract thought, just naturally embellish and stylize things as they absorb information and then spew it back out, even subconsciously. None of us are computers; we can't perfectly recreate information.
Some of it is evolutionary. Before we actually had verbal language, the higher order primates that don't have verbal language, how do they communicate?
I actually don't know.
A lot of it is the equivalent of pantomime and charades.
Oh, right, yeah.
You know, the 2001 scene on the African plains, kind of like beating their chest and like hammering the ground.
You mean that bit from Barbie?
That's just because...
I need to stay topical. There's a Barbie opens in the exact same way.
Okay.
Okay, Ethan. That's cool. Anyway, going on.
Today, the equivalent would be like sending strongly worded diplomatic messages and, you know, scrambling jet fighters and putting nuclear forces on alert. What that is actually doing is kind of the same as, you know, like standing up on a line drawn in the sand and going like, ah.
That is true, yeah. And it's all very embellished. We don't need jet fighters. No one needs a jet fighter. No human being has ever woken up in the morning and been like, I need a jet fighter. No, that's the same thing as this. It sounds to me that at this level, or even just in general, I asked this question from the perspective of someone who's like an amateur who doesn't really know what they're doing most of the time. But most of the answers that you've given are not only applicable to amateurs, but also anyone. Embellishments and stylization have a few things to evaluate before you consider using them. Number one, are they coming naturally? Are they part of the creative process? Are you getting in your own way to add them? Is it a natural part of what you're doing? Number two, do you have the skill set and the gear? Is it feasible within your ability and your range? Is that stylization feasible with what you have at hand and what you have in your head?
My go-to example for that, I'm pretty much at this level. I'm flat out refusing to do vertigo zooms without proper equipment.
Fair.
Because without proper equipment, it just looks half-assed. It looks amateurish because everyone's seen them done with the $100,000, $200,000 motion controls.
I'm pretty sure I have somewhere under my belt a shitty, rumbly vertigo zoom. I'm sure I do. Definitely not published, which is good. And number three, is it part of the vernacular? Is it a part of the story that you're telling? Will it be paid off? Is it consistent? Is it part of the shooting style, or is it nothing? Or if it isn't, are you breaking those rules in a sensible way that will pay off later?
This is maybe one of those where you can look at some experimentation. Can you actually communicate through stylization in a way that isn't just eye candy? And this is where a lot of experimental motion picture art comes from, is using what may seem like technique for the sake of technique to ask questions about perception, reality, whatever. So I think if you can find concepts and questions like that, I think that's a good place to try out testing and practicing. And by this, I mean something like Baraka or Koyaanisqatsi or Povasqatsi.
Oh.
I wouldn't communicate the same way if it was done in a kind of BBC David Attenborough narrated kind of way.
If we're going to talk about embellishment stylization being not only a natural outcome of the creative process, feasible and a part of a piece's vernacular, but I think it's important that we try to discuss good examples of this so people know what to look for and what a coherent, stylized, or embellished shooting style looks like, if that makes sense. Whether or not it's experimental, because the first thing that I think of when I think of a stylized shooting style is Sam Raimi, and that is a part of his vernacular. It never feels forced. It is coherent. He has all the skills and feasibility for it most of the time, and it's clearly the way that he thinks. You can tell that he's not trying to emulate anything. It's just the way that he thinks. And then experimental stuff like Koyaanisqatsi, for example. It's vital that it's stylized like that because it wouldn't work, as you said.
This is one of those moments that you feared earlier. Yeah.
Damn it! Okay, alright. Yeah, well, I can keep giving you examples right now. For example, on a similar note to is it Koyaanisqatsi or Koyaanisqatsi?
I think it's Koyaanisqatsi.
Okay. A similar vein to that, Werner Herzog's Lessons of Darkness is very similar.
Didn't know that.
It's a 54-minute long documentary that is currently only available on YouTube, of all things. It is from the mid to late 90s. This is when my modern history knowledge begins to fail. It is a documentary about the oil fields in Kuwait.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Like, yeah, I know the iconic images of the burning oil
Yeah,
fields.
yeah. And it's most of it, 80% of it, except for a few small interviews that are not in English and not subtitled, is helicopter shots with classical music of the wreckage and the fire. And then being Werner Herzog, Werner Herzog's voice occasionally chimes in with some kind of like dour, biblical quote or statement. It is regularly implied throughout that he is an alien in that documentary, like he has a narrative perspective. It's one of my favorite movies ever, because it wouldn't have the same effect if it wasn't what it was. If it were Werner Herzog exploring the oil fields of Kuwait and talking to people and getting information from them and then walking around and giving his thoughts to the camera face to face, it just wouldn't be the same at all.
Yeah, I think documentary is interesting in that sense because I personally believe that the objective documentary does not exist.
Oh, yeah.
I don't believe that objective truth and nothing but the truth documentary can ever exist.
Well, is that because objective truth can't exist?
No, it's just the medium is inherently subjective.
Because it's inherently stylized in some way.
Not necessarily that, but just the act of press record, stop record.
Right. You're controlling what people are
Is
saying.
editorial.
Yeah.
As in, there is a subjective choice on when to start recording, when to stop recording, where to point the camera is an editorial choice because you cannot capture
I
everything.
think it's a really natural through line from any conversation about stylizing movies and TV is documentary. Like when they apply their own style to truth and what it becomes and what you feel.
I do want to draw the distinction, even though I don't believe that we can ever make an objectively true documentary. I'm not necessarily saying that a documentary can't be true.
Yeah, I know
I'm
what
just
you mean.
saying that it can't be objectively true.
Like it can contain information that is true.
By extension, I believe that all documentaries, at least in their heart, are emotionally true and subjectively true. But I think the objectively true documentary is an illusion.
Wow. Hashtag
I think things like Errol Morris, for example, on the surface may seem objective. It doesn't tend to insert a lot of questions by himself. It appears as if he's letting the interview subjects go wherever they want to go, unprompted. But so many times in his documentaries, just the fact of letting the subjects go where they want to go. Are you familiar with Errol Morris documentaries?
Really vaguely. I'll have to look them up because we definitely learnt about him at uni.
Look up Dr. Death. That's probably the one where it becomes the most obvious.
Errol Morris, because I feel like I've watched at least one of his things.
Dr. Death is probably the one that illustrates this the most.
Ooh, okay.
There is other stylistic embellishments that he uses as well. There is the Interrotron, which is far less terrifying than it sounds.
Jesus. That's intense.
It's essentially a periscope to allow the subject to talk straight into camera and still see the interviewer.
Wow. Is that a tool that the viewer is aware of or something you have to know about the behind the scenes to know is there?
The subject is talking straight and dead center down the barrel.
Wow.
But to them, they see reflected in the periscope, in the Interrotron, the face of the interviewer.
Wow.
Right, so spoiler alert, Dr. Death is working in the US, I believe, prison system. He designed devices for delivering the death penalty in the US penal system. So designing the equivalent of electric chairs or injection systems. And through that activity, he has come to the conclusion that the Holocaust was impossible.
Oh, that was...
His knowledge of designing execution systems told him, or at least he believed, that the Germans couldn't execute people on the scale.
Sorry, that entire sentence was the equivalent of walking onto a train track with the expectation of being hit by a train and then being shot. That was not a fun thing to hear at all.
But there is no ridiculing, there is no kind of refuting of this person's ideas, but just the fact that Errol Morris in the edit lets him run to just the most absurd lengths
right.
makes it a moral judgment on this character.
It's like Louis Theroux on a slightly lesser extent, because Louis Theroux still provides his thoughts as he speaks, but a lot of his documentary style, or at least his directors, given that he's the presenter, not the director, focuses on letting people talk and present themselves for as long as possible and just showing who they are. All of his things about the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, he is wholly unjudgmental in some of those sequences. He is judgmental in some, like he asks questions that skew on the side of rational thought, but a lot of the time it's just pointing a camera at the Westboro Baptist Church doing Westboro Baptist Church things and allowing you to draw your own conclusion, which is normally, what are they doing? Dear God.
Errol Morris is even less It's kind of strange because he's putting himself far less in his documentaries, but in some ways that is what makes it more subjective. And he's a lot more dramatization. He doesn't really use much narration, if at all, and somehow that manages to make it more subjective rather than less.
Jesus.
There is a series of interviews with British filmmakers talking about inspiration from British painters, a series done by the Tate Modern Gallery. And there is one episode with Christopher Nolan talking about his inspiration from Francis Bacon.
Is that the Francis Bacon who has that one with the Pope? And he's all up, and then there's other guy there's the man with meat as well, with him all the meat around him, the big. Okay,
yeah.
All right. Yeah. The meat guy.
He's introducing it by kind of going like, whenever he's coming up about things that we can't talk about because we don't have the language for it, we need to find another way. I.e., for him, that's looking to art. I think some of that style and embellishment, when you get to that stage where you consciously want to try and inject some of that, then the question is, what does this technique, this flourish, do that you cannot do any other way?
Which is I think it's a slightly more in-depth way of asking, is this necessary? Yeah.
So the whole Baraka, Koyaanisqatsi, Povizqatsi, there's obviously been some, may not even be conscious, but at some point there has been a question. I am doing it this way because I don't know any other way that could express parts of what I want to express.
And the same as Lessons of Darkness. That approach 100% came out of a desire to express a certain thought or feeling, and the only way to do that was in silence with classical music and helicopter shots. I know that we're going off into documentary, but I think it's important. If someone, hypothetically Werner Herzog, wants to make a movie that makes someone meditate in depth about destruction, it is necessary to have a lot of time to just look and listen, hence the structure of that documentary. Same for Koyaanisqatsi, I'm sure.
Other good examples there are Requiem for a Dream, with the use of the snorri cams and the time lapses, in combination of the two. Not sure that there are many other ways of showing, betraying, expressing those particular states of mind. Then you got places where you take it too far. It's fine in the balance when the garnish becomes main effort and we forget the actual meal beneath it. Not that it can't work, but it's a question of like, do you want to make work that people engage with and consume, but then it's gone and they never ever engage with it or remember it later?
That makes me think of Blood Meridian, book that's been mulling on my brain for a while. I'm sorry that we've gone from documentary to book, even though we were just trying to talk about narrative cinematography, but, you know, all art is the same. Have you read much? God, I'm just pulling out all of the insufferable, pretentious man movies and books right now. God, I'd like to apologize in advance to everyone listening and watching right now for my conduct. I will talk about Barbie more in the following episode, whether Kim likes it or not. Anyway, have you read much? Can't say his name without stuttering. It's not a good name for people who stutter every now and then. Cormac McCarthy. Have you read much of him?
Only what's the trilogy? The Border.
The Border trilogy, yeah.
Yeah, and I personally found it too depressing to check out anymore. Sorry, not depressing, bleak. Too bleak to really seek out.
I recently finished Blood Meridian, which is my first of his books. Maybe my last, because it's just a miserable read. It's so bleak and so violent.
Bleak, yes. There's No Country for Old Men.
The Road.
The Road, yeah. Okay, yeah.
That's the big one. I think there's No Country for Old Men and The Road are the two big ones that I'm aware of. I think he also wrote a Ridley Scott movie once. Anyway, there's a lot of debate, especially about Blood Meridian. Not only about whether the content is necessary, because it is just the most violent book I've ever read in my life, but whether and I'm sure you're familiar with his prose, a lot of debate on a larger scale if his prose is necessary. His lyrical, rambling, grammarless, punctuationless prose, whether it is a necessary part of his storytelling or meaningless stylization. Like, a lot of debate about that. Also, rest in peace, he passed away recently, I think. Yeah. I'm having finished Blood Meridian in the, like, kind of, it definitely added something camp. It's unique. I think because Blood Meridian is so abstract, it adds to the dreamlike effect of the whole story. However, I did get a bad taste in my mouth when I realized that was how he wrote everything. Everything that he writes is written like that. And that's when I begin to wonder whether that stylization is necessary at all. I enjoyed Blood Meridian because his prose felt like a stinky old man in a saloon in the Wild West regaling me with the story. That's how it felt. There are some instances where I don't know if that would work for me with a certain story.
Yeah, to me, that's kind of like a a strange question. I do think that at a certain point, fiction needs a certain style and embellishment in the prose. Otherwise, how do we know it's fiction? You know what I mean? It's kind of like that subconscious need. So if you take that by extension, would William Burroughs be William Burroughs without the prose? Would James Joyce be James Joyce without the prose? Would Jack Kerouac be Jack Kerouac without the prose? Probably the biggest influence on like several generations of writers, Hemingway. Take other examples. Douglas Adams had a certain style of writing, and would it be Douglas Adams' novel without the dry wit?
Probably not.
Exactly. It's about what does your story need, rather than trying to force embellishment and style upon it. Like you said, that's an embellishment.
An abstract embellishment.
It's good, like you said, to study when it's done, when it's kind of intrinsic, it's diegetic, it's organic. The story needs to be told this way. But I think that's another embellishment.
Nice.
But I think too often the wrong lesson gets taken from it by beginners, or when we first make a few steps, rather than kind of go, yes, this embellishment, this style, this trick, this technique is needed in this story.
It is the reason the story is the story.
Or it's kind of like not understanding that this particular stylized embellishment is intrinsic to this particular story told by this particular practitioner. So we take the embellishment and go try to apply that to something where it doesn't necessarily fit intrinsically, diegetically, organically. I think sometimes I would like to see us in terms of teaching balancing things. Too often we are giving only the great examples. I don't think we are juxtaposing that often enough with the examples where XYZ lesson doesn't work. I.e., we're not making film students, we're not making art students study enough shit work.
And we really should. I'm passionate about that. It's so annoying when someone's like, what are you watching a bad movie for? Excuse me. And my excuse is always, I need to watch the bad movies to know what not to do. And my real answer is actually, I'm feeling terrible. But, it's a whole different camp of watching bad movies. But for now, I can justify it by saying I need to watch bad movies to know what not to do, right?
That kind of borderline between mediocre and shit is a really interesting level to study from the perspective of like, how do we improve this? What could we do to him? And it's really challenging.
In that case, if I were to sum up, we have a pretty cohesive list here of stylization, information, questions. I tried to figure out another shin, but it didn't work.
Which is a stylistic device in and of itself.
Yeah. Questionations. Is it necessary? Does it fit? Is it a part of the vernacular? All those kind of fit under the same umbrella, those particular considerations. Is it a part of the story you're telling? Is it a part of the style? Will it be paid off? If it isn't, why isn't it? Very important.
A deeper lying even question that should precede that is, are you creating eye candy, or do you want to create something with a little bit more substance?
Are you forcing it is an important question. Is it necessary? Is it part of the vernacular? Are you forcing it? Is it feasible? And under that, subheadings, skills and gear. Do you have the skills for it? Do you have the gear for it? Or will it just show off how bad your skills and your gear are at that point in your career?
Actually, I'm wondering, I think a natural question then becomes like, okay, so if I should hold off on the more stylistic techniques so that I don't show my lack of skills in them, when do I pick up those skills then, right?
That is a good question, yeah.
I'm wondering, could we find a vernacular, a style where shitty technique is intrinsic?
Have you seen the first Evil Dead movie?
Well, I'm not sure whether that is kind of deliberately showing off shit technique.
No, good point. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
I guess parody.
Parody? You could do parody. I've always been totally repelled by the excuse, it's meant to look bad. I do it maybe once every thing that I make. I try to be very, very careful about it. At my level, I'm inclined to say that unless you're making it extremely obvious and trying to take the piss very, very hard, if you're going to make something that looks bad on purpose, people are going to assume that it's bad, not on purpose.
Well, that's why I'm saying that, like, can we find some kind of device? I think the
vernacular.
The filmmaker, no, but I think that was a bit of a niche in 90s, early noughts. Oh, it's the movie. So there was Living in Oblivion with John Turturro and Steve Buscemi.
Love Steve Buscemi.
But like a low budget, independent, no budget film production going wrong. It's Bowfinger.
Love Bowfinger. That's a classic.
And then you get the more obscure examples like Man Bites Dog. So I guess it's kind of a lot of what spawned the found footage genre a bit later on.
Oh wow, it's a great premise for a movie.
Like Man Bites Dog actually does have some greater psychological moral depth to it than it may seem.
It sounds very Blood Meridian-y, actually.
On the surface, it could read like a murder porn, but there is actually some more depth to it. But in any case, there was a little subgenre niche of like movies about making movies on like a shitty level, shoestring level. Maybe that could be a way of like trialing out like those shitty techniques until you perfect them.
Yeah, I like that. Almost like you have the safety net of whatever narrative is occurring outside of the shitty movie can be shot traditionally, and then once you get to showing off the shitty movie, you can have a crack at anything you want. I like that.
Right. Any other conclusions, or do you want to try and wrap
I'm
this
pretty
up?
well set. I just leave with: is it necessary? Is it natural? Is it feasible? Can we make another N? Necessary, natural.
Is that necessary?
No,
to
probably not.
embellish that?
No, this embellishment isn't reasonable. No.
I do want to add though that
Kim's final note. This is a new section. Kim's final note.
all work and no play.
Yes.
It
so
is
true,
important
yeah.
within that to give yourself a space, give yourself a venue, give yourself like a project occasionally, or as often as you like, just to play. Because full circle, I did swing that same pendulum that you did, and I did definitely go too far in the kind of structured, always having a reason. At some point, it took a lot of effort of breaking my way out of that. It did get to a stage where a lot of my work felt uninspiring to me because it was starting to feel too reasoned. Find those places where you can play a bit.
That's a great closer, in my opinion. Like, find those places where you can play a bit. Done.